And some breaking news for you now. The Prime Minister is due to speak at a news conference at 3 o'clock this afternoon, we're hearing. That's in half an hour's time or so on migration. It all comes after news today that net migration hit a new record high in the year to June 2023. We'll, of course, bring you that live as it comes into us. Around 3 o'clock, we're expecting it. Well, let's get more on those figures. The Office for National Statistics revising up its data to June 2023 by 166,000 to 906,000 when it comes to net migration. Joining me now is Associate Director for Migration, Trade and Communities at the Institute for Public Policy Research, Marley Morris. Good to see you, Marley. So it's a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty situation, this. It's either good news or not so good news, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, the numbers are going down according to the latest figures by around 20% compared to the year before. Obviously, overall, the ONS has revised its estimates, and now the peak, the year ending June 2023, was just over 900,000 for net migration, which is a fair bit higher than what we previously understood it to be. But it's worth saying that we expect, I think, a further fall in net migration in the next figures, which will come out in May. And that's because we're still seeing the full impact of the last government's policies to restrict student dependence and health and care work dependence and so on, which we'll see in the new figures coming next year.
Yeah, so the trend is downwards and the figures are coming down, even if they're from a higher place than we initially thought. Dig into the reasons why a little bit more, if you would. You've talked about students. Is that because they're no longer allowed to bring dependents with them if they're doing certain courses as they were in the old days? And then explain a bit more as well about the employment sector and perhaps why that area is being more stringent.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing two key trends. With respect to students, there has been a sharp drop in the number of students bringing dependents, family members to the UK after the government imposed quite tough restrictions. And some of that is seen in the latest figures coming out today, and we'll see more of that, I think, in the figures that come out next year for the whole of this calendar year. And then, of course, we've quite a big impact in a fall in health and care work visas. Now, we're seeing that in the monthly data, but that will come through in the net migration figures as well next time round. And that's because the government, the Home Office has been tighter in terms of its restrictions on issuing visas to care workers in particular, and we're also seeing restrictions in the family members of care workers being able to come to the UK, and that's led to some big drops in those visas as well.
Why do you think the figures were so far out, going from 672,000 to being revised to 906,000? It's a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are two main reasons. First of all, the ONS is a new methodology for the ONS, so it's developing and refining the way it does things. And then secondly, inherently, there's always a bit of uncertainty with these figures because the ONS is making provisional estimates for migration, because the only way you can estimate migration is to predict how many people will come to the UK for more than a year, and so will count as long-term migrants rather than short-term. And of course, you don't know that until you've got to the point where they've been able to stay for those 12 months. So the ONS does a kind of estimate to try to predict whether people will stay or not, but it's not always right. And so that means that sometimes these figures are revised.
OK, that's explained it very well. And of course, the small boats coming across the channel get a huge amount of publicity. What percentage of those people coming into the country included in these figures?
Well, it's a very small figure overall. So, I think, for instance, for the first 3 months of this year, I think we're on about 25 to 30,000 people arriving compared to the overall immigration figures, which are in the hundreds of thousands. So it's a very small proportion overall. It is worth saying the trend there it's slightly up on last year, though there's not a huge amount in it so far. And of course, we are seeing that translate into the asylum figures as well, because the asylum backlog is still very large. It's just under 100,000, and so there's clearly a lot of effort for the government in terms of reducing that backlog by processing claims and bringing down the costs of the asylum system, which are almost record highs at the moment.
Yeah, and you've touched on this briefly. We are expected to hear from the Prime Minister himself in about 25 minutes or so. But what do you think the government's main strategy is when it comes to bringing that figure, that net migration figure, down further?
Well, the government has said that it wants to take a different approach to work migration in particular and link up the immigration and skills system so that we're doing more to support domestic skills, so there's less of a need for employers to recruit from abroad. And they've already commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to look into two sectors in particular, IT and engineering. So that's, I think, the government's approach. So they're less focused on necessarily just putting in crude restrictions and more focused on, or how do we actually support sectors in the UK that are currently relying on workers from abroad to recruit more domestically, to improve their working conditions, and to do more to address skill shortages in other ways than just recruiting from overseas.
OK, really interesting. Marley Morris from the Institute for Public Policy Research, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Reform UK leader, Nigel Farage, has faced questions over the